Hi everybody. So we're very lucky to have Tim Fellows here today who's going to be doing this next session. So Tim is a project manager at JISC, and this is a not-for-profit that provides various services to support further and higher education institutions. So in this role, Tim is responsible for the growth and development of the Octopus platform and works closely with a range of researchers, research support and library staff to ensure that the platform delivers on its goal of improving research culture and serving researchers of all disciplines. So previously, Tim has worked on other research-adjacent services, including ethics review, clinical compliance, and human tissue banking platforms, which sounds fascinating. So over to you, Tim.
Thank you very much. Right, hello everyone. My notes have a few pointers here, and it says first off, I'm here today to talk about Octopus, which I think probably doesn't need mentioning. I think that may be fairly obvious to everyone. So Octopus is a UKRI-funded publishing platform that takes a very different approach compared to the traditional concept of a research paper when it comes to publication. I think the platform's a very good example of how the idea of open can be taken to an extreme, to provide a platform that, well, amongst many other things, it creates a fairer playing field for researchers. It removes barriers to publishing and to accessing research, as well as removing potential sources of bias and providing greater recognition for those in specialised roles. In doing so, it creates a more inclusive and collaborative research culture. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about exactly how it does that, and hopefully have a bit of a discussion about how we can make sure it continues to do that and does the best job possible at doing that. So the established open access publishing model has it's improved access to research outputs, but there are perhaps, amongst others, two fundamental failings, I believe, in terms of inclusion when it comes to the established OA model that I'd like to highlight. Note that I'm talking about open access and not open research here. So the first is that it relies upon the idea that publishing in a prestigious journal demonstrates research's inherent value. I would argue that whilst items published in more prestigious journals likely have been included on the basis of some factors that should represent their value to a degree, the prestige of a journal has a disproportionate effect on the perceived value of a publication, and therefore on the incentives for a researcher in terms of where to publish. Couple that with the large article processing charges that more popular journals will often require, and this represents, I think, quite a significant failing of the established OA model to be inclusive, whereby the most prestigious opportunities to publish and therefore the greatest career incentives sit behind these barriers that I think are much more significant to those in lower income economies. So as an example, we saw a graph earlier of the cost of a Zoom call across different countries by the GDP per capita of those countries. And it'd be very interesting to see something similar, for instance, the cost of publishing in Nature, perhaps, by country. So we have this monetary cost associated with being seen as a valuable publication. Those who are unable to afford to publish in a higher impact or more prestigious journal may have their work seen as less reliable. Prestigious journals also tend to be Anglophone, and in many cases display a disproportionate focus on issues that are most prevalent in the Anglosphere. Maybe many is not fair, but it's certainly a trend that is talked about. Which means that I think not only researchers who do not speak English fluently put at a disadvantage, but also researchers are incentivized to focus on issues and research topics that are more pressing in Anglophone geographies instead of those that may be more relevant closer to home. And to sidetrack slightly, I think this actually echoes what was mentioned earlier in the keynote about the idea that openness shouldn't just be about sharing Euro-American knowledge with the global public, but that the inverse should also be true, that it should be about sharing things the other way. So ultimately where a researcher's work is recognized as a contribution to our collective knowledge as a whole without being seen as more or less valuable based upon the particular geography that its subject matter is from. So this means that researchers who do not have access to funds to overcome article processing charges, who cannot afford to devote the time and resources to become fluent in English, or to working with those perhaps who can help write it up in English for them, or who focus on issues that are perhaps less relevant to Europe and North America as a whole, are forced into a situation where their work may be judged as less valuable. So we need to provide a space that has no barriers to publishing, where authors can receive feedback on their work and those viewing a publication can see an assessment of its quality agnostic of the actual impact of its finding, agnostic of this prestige factor, so they can determine its reliability. And that's what Octopus is all about. So to provide a bit of background on how the platform came about, I'll briefly mention Octopus's founder, Alex Freeman. So Alex worked for a number of years as a filmmaker at the BBC, something I think she's far too modest about, to be honest. She had a very interesting career working with the likes of David Attenborough and so on nature documentaries. And she then came back to academia after a number of years. Now, in her job at the BBC, naturally, her task had been to communicate scientific information to a general audience, to provide a compelling narrative, perhaps, of what is going on with this scientific information in a way that the general public would find engaging. And she found upon returning to academia that she was having to do something rather similar when it came to communicating findings for publication in a paper. In that, again, researchers were being incentivized to publicize something with a narrative, with this compelling account of the findings, not necessarily what they actually did as part of their research. That sort of was moved to the sidelines, I suppose. So whilst the dissemination of narrative-focused findings is not in itself an inherently bad thing, the disproportionate attention that it receives means that full details of what is actually being done is often dismissed as supplementary. And that's where Octopus comes in. So Octopus is designed to sit alongside journals as what we like to call the primary research record. So this is a place where research can be shared freely, without barriers, and in full detail for the benefit of specialists. By providing a dedicated space for this element of scholarly comms, journals are free to devote themselves to what they do best, which is the communication of findings, whilst Octopus can be this place to get all of the nitty-gritty details of exactly what happened with your research. So, I'll talk a little bit about what the platform actually does, how it all fits together. So the first thing to mention is that Octopus is an entirely free platform. It's open source, so our code is all available on GitHub and so on, and anyone can browse the platform. There is no restriction to just hopping on the platform and taking a look through anything that's published there naturally. Similarly, for authors, the only requirement to publish is having an ORCID ID. There is nothing else involved to stop you from being able to publish your work, and you can actually publish that immediately. So there's no delays for things like editors and so on to stop you from getting your work out there. So you can publish immediately and register your priority straight away, should you choose to. I think probably the biggest single trait about Octopus that is important to mention is that, as I said, it doesn't use this concept of a traditional research paper. So instead, the platform uses 8 different publication types that are modeled after the research process. This relies upon the idea that research follows a kind of fundamental series of steps. The process of inquiry has this series of steps that should be more or less universal when it comes to discovery as a process, I suppose. And this opens up quite a few interesting new ways of working, potentially, that I'll get onto in a moment, that the platform can facilitate. A few other points to make. There's no pre-publication peer review. So instead, the community get tools to assess, provide feedback on, and moderate publications post-publication. And the platform is also integrated with existing systems, so we've already heard a little bit about this. So the platform naturally uses DOIs for its publications. Raw IDs are used to identify things like the information about funders, and we also integrate with ORCID so that we can, as well as use that for account, we also pull in information about affiliations. But I think the one you've already heard about is our integration with the Cambridge's Apollo repository. So we're working with Publications Router, which is another JISC platform that sends publications from a publishing site to an institutional repository by directing them through their affiliations. And thanks to Agostina and the Cambridge Apollo repository and the funding that they acquired, we've been able to start building that integration to get Octopus publications sending over to institutional repositories, which is a huge step for us. We've also got plans in future to integrate with more persistent identifiers, so RAID IDs, research activity identifiers, for instance, grant IDs, and so on. So we're trying to make sure that we're really, as seamlessly as possible, fitting ourselves into the existing ecosystem of all these other identifiers and all these other things that need to be tracked to make sure that you don't have to keep entering the same bit of information in different places and things like that. We can programmatically determine what's going on with your publication. And finally, last but very much not least, we're a UKRI-funded platform, so we do comply with UKRI open access policy. I thought that's quite an important one to mention. So, I said more on these 8 publication types. So each publication type, as I said, is designed to match a particular step in the research process. And as you can see on the screen here, they fit together to form what we call a branching chain of publications. So this starts with a research problem, then a hypothesis, a protocol or a method, then your results or your data, your analysis, your interpretation, and finally your real-world application. As you can see, I think one quite important point to note here is that the terms that you see on the screen here, and this is a big point for inclusivity in particular because we want to make sure we're interdisciplinary, these terms here are somewhat STEM focused. If you're a researcher who doesn't work in STEM, you'll be looking at some of these and thinking that's not quite what we use, that's not quite what we say. And there's a very big point to make here, which is that the platform is designed to work with all disciplines. We're using these terms because these terms are what we have that is convenient at the moment, but I think what's actually quite helpful is instead of thinking about these in terms of that's the problem, or that's the results, or that's the hypothesis, is to think about them in terms of the question you're trying to answer at that stage. So to outline that, that means that the research problem is perhaps, what's the gap in the knowledge? What don't we know here? The hypothesis is what do we think will happen? The method or the protocol is how will we find it? How will we explore this? The results are or the data, as it says on here, are what did we find? The analysis is what can we infer from those results? The interpretation is what does that mean? What can we kind of see from the patterns and so on that have emerged from the results? And finally, the real-world application is fairly straightforward. It's how does this actually apply in the real world, as you might have guessed. So hopefully that makes it a bit easier to think about this if you're not from a STEM background and if you're looking at some of these publication types and thinking maybe they don't quite fit for me. It's something we are working with researchers to make sure that we can kind of come up with new terms that are more universal, and that's, I think, perhaps a slight failing on our part at the moment that we don't have that in there in terms of inclusivity. So, that's a good point. If you're particularly sharp-eared, you'll have noticed I just rattled off 7 publication types. There are, of course, 8, otherwise we wouldn't be Octopus. And that 8th one is a peer review. So peer reviews within Octopus are treated as a publication in their own right. Peer reviewing is a valuable skill and should be given the same sort of recognition as for any other type of research output. So they have their own DOI, their own license, and so on, and they're treated with equal weighting to any other publication on the platform. As you can probably guess from this lovely network here, these publications don't have to fit together in a completely linear fashion. It doesn't just have to be one research problem, one hypothesis, one method, and so on. Multiple publications can be linked to each other. So you could have multiple, well, let's use an example on here. We have a hypothesis that's been taken into 3 different protocols, 3 different methods. That's 3 different ways of testing that hypothesis that have been suggested. I'll show you a practical example of this in a moment. These can also be tied back together, so you can see here there's a meta-analysis of several different data publications down in the bottom center, again where things are getting tied back together. So this can kind of be taken off into new directions. You can have multiple people specifying different ways to investigate a hypothesis and things like that. The other thing that's quite important to note here is you can see right down here on the right, we have this problem coming off. And this is a big part of what the platform does. So we've got this research project that started from a single problem in the top. This is this single gap in the knowledge, and everything else underneath that stems in some way from the idea of exploring that gap in the knowledge. Over here, what we can see is another problem. What's happened here is during this analysis, someone has identified a new gap in knowledge. They've seen something that is perhaps implied by this analysis here or something else that's been identified, and they've taken that off into their own problem, this new research problem that is ready to form its own chain a bit like this, but on this new gap. So the idea is that we have these big interconnected branching chains of research around a single problem, but those in themselves are part of a much bigger network of all of these problems that derive from each other, because ultimately all research is in some way derived from someone else's knowledge and someone else's efforts previously. So the hope is that this will aid collaboration. It showcases how research is interconnected, and it means we'll see people very much freely working together to put publications onto the back of each other's. Right, I think that's enough talking from a PowerPoint, so I will switch over to looking at the actual platform now. Let me see if I can do this. Okay, so here we are on the platform itself. I'm going to have to look this way because unfortunately I can't see this on this screen. So there are a few things that should be immediately obvious here. You can see along the top we've started off with this research problem. It's been taken into a single hypothesis, And then it's actually split out into two methods followed by two sets of results, two analyses, and then this single interpretation. So we've got two different strands that have been taken here. You can see that the top method publication over there is a method using online surveys to test this hypothesis. Below it, there is a secondary method for qualitative interviews. So these are two different ways to test the hypothesis, as I mentioned earlier. Now, in this case, I do happen to know that this is the same team that worked on these two different publications, so they're still part of the same project. But that doesn't have to be the case. It could be the case that a completely independent researcher has come along, had a look at that hypothesis, and said, that looks interesting, I would like to see where I can take that. And they've suggested their own method and taken that out in its own direction, based upon the work of someone else that's already put it on the platform. So I think that's quite an interesting example of where people can sort of spontaneously come together to collaborate on things like this. Another one I'd like to point out here is our data analyses. So up at the top here, you can see we have this analysis publication by G. Reccia. And you can see over here on our hypothesis that we're currently viewing, we have this list of authors, including G. Reccia. Now, if I switch over to viewing this publication, you will see that G. Reccia is the sole author of this. And this is, I think, a really nice thing with the platform is that we get to provide a space to showcase the efforts of specialists. So by benefit of having these individual publication types that represent these fundamental steps in the process of research, in the process of inquiry, we can provide dedicated spaces for those who are providing specific parts of that process to shine. So as a data analyst, you may often find yourself being relegated to somewhere in the author list, but it may be unlikely. We often hear from analysts and other specialists that it's quite unlikely for them to actually be the first author on a paper, because there's so many other people doing things in there, and their role isn't always the one that's most recognized. But with Octopus, they get a place where they are the first author. This is their publication. As you can see, they're the only author, and this is the bit where they can really showcase what it is that they do. Similarly, going back to the peer reviews, we have the same concept applied there. So peer reviews aren't in the same way as they would be on a full paper where you're reviewing the entire paper. Instead, a peer review attaches to any one individual publication on Octopus, and these publications, remember, are these much smaller steps of the research process. So I, as another data analyst, for instance, who may not be comfortable with reviewing an entire paper and everything that goes into that, but may have some very relevant feedback to give on the analysis of that paper, could come in here, have a look at this results publication, come down here and just take this option to write a review, and that will be a peer review specifically of that analysis, which again provides a much more focused and specialized form of feedback for these researchers. I'll go back to the sort of research assessment processes and functions that we use in a moment. There's a few other things I'd like to point out here. So I talked about the platform trying to remove barriers to publishing and avoiding sources of bias. Hopefully the lack of barriers to publishing is fairly clear with what I've said already about how you can, for instance, just by logging in, come in and do things like write a link research problem, write an interpretation, and so on, and just put your publications out there. I can just hit this button up the top to do so. But what about sources of bias? I think this is quite an important point to make. So you'll notice on this author name, or in fact on any of our author names, if I go back to somewhere where we have a few more, you can see that we obscure first names. Now this is because of the slightly unfortunate fact that a first name may be a source of bias because it may determine things like gender and so on. So we obscure those to make sure that they can't be something that could affect someone's assessment of a publication. Similarly, we also don't show affiliations here. It goes back to this idea that perhaps a publication could be seen as more valuable based upon some sort of prestige factor that I mentioned earlier with journals. The same also does apply to institutions. So if someone sees, for instance, well, I suppose the University of Cambridge on a publication, it's quite possible that they may view that as inherently more valuable in some way without necessarily having a look at what the content of that publication is. Similarly, if they see a university that perhaps isn't quite so highly thought of, they may just automatically judge it as slightly lower, even unconsciously. So we obscure that. You can, in fact, go and have a look at that if you want to. So, for instance, if I hop onto this account here, and it will take a few seconds to load, we'll be able to dig in and see a bit of information about this user. So all of our accounts are linked to ORCID profiles, so you can see information from their ORCID profile here. You can see their works. And if you come down here, you can also see the activity that they've actually had on Octopus itself. So you can see the publications that they've made, you can see the peer reviews, and things like that. And the reason I mention this is because I'm about to start talking about research assessment, and this accountability that we can provide with this page, I think is quite important for that. So, we're back on our main publication page. Now, we have a bit of a problem to solve with Octopus that hopefully we have by providing these tools, but ultimately this is the idea that because we don't have any barriers to publication, because we don't have pre-publication peer review, because people can just throw something out there, there is no inherent expectation of quality when something reaches the platform, because it could be anything. It's ultimately just dependent on the ORCID ID, on that user having an ORCID ID, and therefore we need to provide tools to let the community easily moderate themselves and easily make sure that they can show whether or not something is of sufficient quality. So there are three ways in which we do this. The first, as I said, is these specialized peer reviews that you can leave on a publication. Anyone can leave those, and they are also publicly displayed. As I said, they're a publication in their own right. But perhaps there's a major concern on this publication. Perhaps someone's plagiarism, there's image manipulation, whatever it may be. They can flag a concern with this publication. And this is for the slightly more hard-hitting, I suppose, criticisms that they may have with actual major issues, ethical issues, for instance. They can select an option, enter the details for why they feel this way, and this will do a few things when they raise this red flag against the publication. First, it will display on this publication that the red flag has been raised, by who and when. Second, it will display on the user who raised its profile that they raised it, so there is some accountability so people can see who has actually done that. And third, it will open dialogue between them and the author of this publication so that they can discuss this red flag and hopefully come to a resolution. The third form of research assessment we're giving, I think this is possibly the most controversial of them, that's why we haven't actually launched this yet, because we need to get it right, is a quality metric system. And so this is something that I think piggybacks upon this idea that we've got these fundamental steps of the research process with a much more granular definition than a whole paper, which means, in theory, there should be some sort of common terms that can be used to summarize the perceived quality of that step of the process of inquiry. So what we're doing is we're working with researchers to try and identify what those terms are so that we can use them as a way to rate publications. So to give an example, let's say this, we've got an analysis publication here, we've got a data set. Let's say on this data set there are three different criteria. There's whether it's of sufficient size to test the hypothesis, whether it's well annotated, and whether it's fully available, perhaps, just an example. Other users would then be able to come in and rate on perhaps a 1 to 5 scale on each of those three criteria what they perceive that publication to be in terms of how effectively it's achieving those three metrics. And then over time that builds up an aggregate picture of the quality of that publication. And what that means is we have a metric that we can use as an alternative to the impact factors that are used in traditional journals. We need some sort of way to measure something numerically so that we have a score that can be quickly digested by readers to give them an impression of what other readers think, to provide this kind of quick credibility, hopefully. But we need to stay away from popularity. And so the way to do that, we believe, is by creating this system to quickly give your assessment of the quality of a publication. Now, I've just had the 10-minute warning a couple of minutes ago. I should have talked faster. So perhaps it would be a good point to stop here and see if anyone has any questions on the platform. In particular, whether there's anything you think we could be doing better to make sure that we're ultimately providing the best possible place to make sure that researchers with all disciplines, geographies and so on can be included. And how you think this would be received by researchers is another one that I think would be very interesting to hear about. Ultimately, there is no precedent for how this platform should be used by researchers because it is a new idea and we're just getting researchers on board and they're deciding how to use it. We're just trying to provide a framework. So really there are no wrong answers, there are no bad questions here. So yes, fire away.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. Do you accept publications in other languages?
Yes, thank you for mentioning that, actually. That was quite a big point I wanted to make. So we have an option so that you can select the language that your publication is in. At the moment, you can just publish in that other language and it will sit there in that other language. But what we want to do, and we're working with various sort of AI translation tools to try and come up with a way to do this at the moment, is try and provide a form of automated language translation, if we can manage it. That quality of that translation would also be subject to those same feedback mechanisms as the kind of quality ratings, and hopefully that will give a way for people to get their findings out there in whatever language they speak natively, and then other people will be able to read it in their own language. So the hope is, and this is, it's a fairly ambitious goal, but the hope is we can remove language as a barrier entirely. And obviously that will take some time with making sure that AI language models get more accurate and are able to able to determine a correct translation properly. But the silver lining we do have there is with academic publications often using very technical language, that technical language is often a lot less ambiguous than normal speech. So we're cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to find a way to automatically translate things into other languages.
Hi, thank you. This is really fascinating. My question, I suppose, is, so this is actually a single repository, which means Octopus is not a software that is decentralized and interoperable, which means universities and publishers and other research organizations don't run like an instance of the software. So what was the thinking behind that? And are there sustainability issues, storage issues, and the kind of centralized, the issues that come with centralization of so much? And what is the path ahead for this? And why was an option to decentralize Octopus not considered in the way, such as, for instance, WordPress is decentralized or Mastodon is decentralized, or so that was the thing I was thinking.
It's a good question. I think it's one I could spend a long time answering. In terms of decentralization, I don't, other than the content on the platform itself, which we have an open API, so that could in theory be decentralized. The code is also open source, so in theory that can just be forked by someone else. They can take it and start up their own instance of Octopus if they wanted to. At the moment it's run centrally because ultimately we're building it and putting everything together. But I don't think there's anything to stop it becoming decentralized so long as there is the will from people within the community to support that and make sure that that continues to run. In terms of sustainability, that's, I think, in many ways a much bigger question. At the moment, we are UKRI funded, but at some point we need to become sustainable. And there are various things we're looking at for that. The golden rules are that we will never charge researchers for anything, so neither reading nor publishing, and that we won't be building anything that interferes with the core values of focusing on quality rather than impact, that we won't be closing off any parts of the system, so all the data generated by the system should remain fully openly available and things like that. But within that framework, we need to try and raise some money at some point eventually. And there are a few ways we could do that. We're looking into whether we'd be able to get an endowment from various organizations like the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, who have a pot of money for open science initiatives, as they call it. Possibly trying to pull together support from universities in exchange from some kind of steering or advisory board presence, or perhaps even starting to do things like build an institutional portal where universities can pay some sort of fee in return for certain extra features, certain forms of analysis and things like that, that would sit on top of what everyone can access on the system for free. We're still in the kind of workshopping stage of working with UKRI to look at options at the moment.
And thanks, Tim. I think you can probably guess what my question's going to be about, but I know that you were planning to work with different disciplines to test how this model mapped out in, for example, humanities and social sciences, which is my pet topic. I was wondering how that's going. Have you found communities to work with in that way? And given that, again, this audience has a lot of professionals, like the last time I asked you this question, whether you've had any opportunities to explore with professional practitioners about how Octopus might be used to support people who may never write an entire journal article from start to finish, but may have absolute gold to contribute in one of the different areas of this process.
Yeah, okay. So for the first part, in terms of trying to make sure that we can engage with different disciplines to make sure that the platform's appropriate for them, what we're doing at the moment is we're bundling that up with the sort of quality ratings surveying that we're doing. We're trying to bundle up that with the idea of finding common terminology across disciplines. The reason being that you need to get people thinking about these publications in a way that refers to their discipline before you can ask them about how to assess things according to that discipline. And both of these tasks need to be done at, I think, significant scale to make sure we don't end up excluding anyone. So we're still in this kind of the design phase of that at the moment. So we're working with various people to make sure that we're coming up with a form of responsible design for research assessment, because that's not something that can be jumped at. And hopefully in the next few months we'll be starting to actually send that out there, actually consult and start doing some workshops with researchers on that. You had a second part to your question. That was
so for example, sorry for the people online. the second part was about the practice-based work research. So, for example, we were hearing from people that work in museums earlier on that do incredible research that may not fit the traditional publishing models, but this could be a platform that could accommodate that sort of research.
Yeah, I mean, I think because there are no specific definitions to what has to be in a publication, it can be very simple. So let's say you've done something where perhaps you've not satisfied the criteria for some of the early stages of publication in a way that you may feel you need to if you're writing a paper. You don't necessarily have to write too much for these earlier stages. So for instance, let's look at the research problem on this one. It's really just a couple of paragraphs. And there are various publications on the platform where someone has done something along those lines, like someone's developed a new piece of training material, and their early stage publications are essentially, how do we design this piece of training material in a way that works? And that their method is how they went about designing this thing, and it's when you get to the results, that is the actual piece of training material and things like that. So it can be fitted around, I suppose, it's just around an inquiry process. I think it's important to think about it in terms of those questions rather than these terms up at the top, because I think that helps to frame what you need to put across, because you're providing context for the later stages of publication with the earlier ones to make sure that people can understand where you're going with it, I suppose. And that doesn't mean it has to be dramatically complicated necessarily. Obviously, if you're doing something very complicated, it's preferable, but there aren't strict rules for that, so hopefully that helps.
Yeah, we did have one from Stephen Pinfield that was quite similar to the last question, but there is another one that's just snuck in, which looks like it could be quite short and punchy. How long is UKRI funding Octopus for, and is it a set time?
Yeah, so we've got, we're working with them until, on this round of funding until April next year, and then there should be, obviously, pending their decision, an extension for another 2 years from then. So our funding, and obviously I can't say for sure, but our funding should continue for another 2 years after that, at which point we then obviously need to be making sure we've got some sort of sustainability model in place.
Hi team, thanks for the presentation. Quick question, do you have any examples at the moment of any links with data, for example, that is in other repositories and things like that is contributing to, let's say, analysis or things in here? At the moment or not? Like, if you have any examples in the platform of people who have, let's say, put a research problem, they have a piece of analysis, and then they actually have the data elsewhere, and they have a DOI to the data or something like that. I'm asking this because it relates a bit with the question from decentralization. And it's important to highlight that here you have those little units of like publications, but actually the data underpinning those things is in other places. And it's a real challenge when it comes into open research to bring in all of those things together. And here with Octopus, you also have the potential of doing that, bringing all of that together within the platform.
So I can't off the top of my head think of one that does exactly that, but this is close. This is a results publication based upon a write-up that, actually this was post-printed, this particular example. So this was in Royal Society's journal and was then put into Octopus afterwards based upon that. But yeah, it's a very good point to make. Octopus, because we have this very high-level set of publications that hopefully encompasses the entire process of inquiry, it means you can use the platform as a place to tie together all of your different outputs. So one thing we often find when we speak to researchers about open research, they say, well, there's so many different platforms, you may have protocols.io, there's platforms to design animal experiments, for instance, open science framework, things like that, and they all have different outputs, and they may not necessarily all cover the entire research project. And what Octopus lets you do is to put those in your publication, and you can just refer to them. And this is the place where you tie it all together. This is your kind of home base for showing where all your other bits fit together with your GitHub and whatever's in Zenodo and things like that, your big 100 gigabyte image files or whatever it may be. And we are working on some integrations so that you can put in a reference or a URL to another system, and we'll then detect what system that is and perhaps show an iframe or pull in some metadata from that other system to populate into here so that people can see a sort of quick summary of what that information that's held elsewhere is.
Yeah, I just had a very quick question, but in fact I can see the answer right here. It was just about DOI of all the part of that. So are you giving to every submission, every publication a DOI that can be accessed from anywhere?
Yeah, so every single publication has its own DOI. we have discussed in the past the idea of giving a group of publications a single DOI as well, so you'd be able to refer to, you know, a whole chain as one item, for instance. But it gets a bit tricky because you can have different people contributing who may not even know each other, and therefore this idea of having a DOI for a whole chain, as you saw with the example in the PowerPoint, you know, where do you stop that? Where do you kind of tie a ribbon around it? So we have DOIs for individual publications, but at the moment we don't have anything for a group. It's only for the individual publications.
So, thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much.